Hey everyone, today I want to talk to you about frame rate. So what is frame rate in terms of filming? Frame rate refers to how many still images occur within 1 second of filming, and the most popular frame rate would be 24 frames per second. So within 1 second of viewing, we actually see 24 individual still images. And these images go by so quickly that we actually perceive them as motion, which is really cool, and that is the basis for all filmmaking. Now, there are several different types of frame rates, and in this video, I'm gonna try to help you choose which frame rate to use and when. So like I said, the most popular frame rate is 24 frames per second, and the reason why this is the most popular is because that's how our eyes generally see. So when we walk around it in the real world, a lot of people agree that we see in 24 frames per second. And the biggest reason why people think we see in 24 frames is because there's a couple imperfections that take place in 24 frames per second. There's a little bit of like a blur. We're not getting every single bit of information. And a good test for this is just to wave your hand or move something quickly. If I were to wave my hand, you can see it's kind of blurry, like the fingers are all mushed together. We can't really make sense of it, and our brains like that. We often don't perceive every bit of data, and that's why people feel comfortable viewing things at 24 frames per second. But there are different frame rates. So there's 23.976, there's 30 frames per second, 50 frames per second, 60, 120. There's tons of different frame rates and for different reasons. One of the most popular reasons for different frame rates is different channels. So Europeans have a different television system and it runs on a different frame rate, often 30 or 25 frames per second. They just do things differently over there, and that's why those different frame rates occur. A next reason for using maybe 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second would be for things like video games. A lot of gamers want higher frame rates because they don't want this blurring effect. They want to be able to see really crisp images so that their gameplay isn't interrupted. So that's when we would use a higher frame rate. And the next reason why we would use higher frame rate is to come up with a slow motion image. So when we're capturing something in slow motion, we would use 60 frames per second. So 1 second, we would record 60 individual pictures, and then we would pull those pictures apart to a 24 frame per second timeline. So we're taking that 1 second and we're stretching it out over almost 3 seconds. So we're seeing it longer, and that's where slow motion comes into play. Now, a really cool thing about modern filmmaking is that we can actually subtract frames from a 60 frame per second clip and make it look like 24 frames per second. We can export it so that it looks like 24. And if we can do that, the question is, why would we ever shoot in 24 if we could just reduce frames from 60 without it being a slow motion image? And the reason is data. Honestly, when you start filmmaking, you're gonna have tons of hard drives filling up because filmmaking just takes up so much data and storage. So if you're filming something where you know you're not going to use slow motion, you 100% know this is going to be standard motion clip, it's definitely advised to film in 24 frames per second because that's what it's going to look like. Another reason why we would shoot in 24 frames per second is because audio really likes to line up to 24 frames per second. We almost always use a 48 hertz audio system to record our audio so that our lips line up. When we start using different frame rates, there's a good chance that the audio could get pulled off, and then we're gonna get into a lot of trouble. So if you're filming a regular scene, like an interview or just a scene where there's some dialogue, you definitely wanna shoot 24 frames per second. Now, if you're going out and you're shooting B-roll of fishing or walking or biking or anything, and you think, oh, I might want to slow this down, weddings are often really popular for this, where you're like, I want it to look dreamy, I want to have a slow motion option, then I would highly recommend filming the entire whatever in 60 frames per second. I often film all my B-roll in 60 frames per second. The next frame rate, 120 frames per second, I would reserve for almost pure, sure slow motion. This is when you know 100% this is gonna be a slow motion clip, and I want it super, super slow. So maybe there's a water balloon that you want to try to capture, or some kind of explosion or something. That's when I would use 120 frames per second. But realize that a ton of data is going to get chewed up when you use this frame rate, so please be advised. There's also one more negative that comes with higher frame rates, and that is darker footage. So it's a little bit complicated, but take my word for it. When you shoot higher frame rates, that means that you also have to shoot at higher shutter speeds. So a higher shutter speed will make your image darker, and that can often be a real pain. So if you're shooting at night, or you're shooting in a dark space, a higher frame rate is going to give you a darker image, and that can be very problematic. So keep that in mind when you're planning your film shoots out. If you want to have some slow motion images of fishing or hunting, but you're shooting early morning, you're probably not going to be able to get the best frame rates, or you're going to have to increase your ISO or some other quality controlling thing within your camera, which we'll talk about in other videos, and that can be, it can be problematic to your video. So keep your frame rates in mind when you're planning out your scenes, and once you know everything perfectly, you'll have the best possible video out there. The last thing I do want to talk about is how do we switch our frame rates. Now, I highly recommend using the Blackmagic Cam app on your phone. I think it gives you a ton of cinematic options, and it is just a really incredible app. If you can download this app onto your phone, the way that you switch frame rates is by going into the top left-hand corner, clicking on FPS, which stands for frames per second, and then scrolling to your favorite frame rate depending on your project. If you're using the standard iPhone camera, this just appears in the top right-hand corner, and you just tap it a bunch of times to switch the frame rate. There is one last note I will say. If you're using something besides the iPhone, or you're using some different camera, often because higher frame rates collect more data, sometimes this means your camera will have to reduce the size. So maybe your camera will shoot 4K 24 frames per second, but then when you put it into 60 frames per second, your camera can't handle all that much data, so it actually downgrades the quality of your footage to HD or even smaller. So take a look at your camera settings before you change your frame rate, and make sure that your images aren't getting any smaller than what you had planned on shooting. If your phone does change size when you change your frame rate, and you know, I do want to have lots of slow motion images in this movie, then it might be a good idea to just film your whole movie in HD. Film your entire film in whatever your camera can capture, so that things are uniform. If you don't, when you go to edit, you're gonna have some clips that are really big, some clips that are really small, and it's just gonna be a huge pain. So I think the most important thing is to try to keep all of your clips as uniform as possible, and that will make your editing experience a whole lot easier. If you have any other questions about frame rate, let me know. I think we covered everything, but there's always something that I've missed, and if there is, yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.